Good morning, this is Lisa from Lux Perennials Nursery. We are going to look at pruning perennials today. I have all these great long blooming perennials, and once they've been blooming a few months, they usually need a haircut to keep them blooming for months and months more. I'm going to show you how. We're going to look at a few perennials that bloom 4 or 5 months in a season. This one is Centranthus rubor. Isn't that great color? Starts blooming in May. But you have to really prune it back at least every couple of months. You can do it constantly if you want, but if you don't, this is what it will look like. So we left this one unpruned so you can see it. Can you see that there's a little flower bud on top? But the rest of that, those aren't buds. That flower is spent. So it's done. So the plant looks like this, not a lot of great color. We're gonna clean it up. So there's a couple different ways I can do this. I can just take something like this to the whole plant and cut it down by half. The other option I have, and I'm just going to show you this, is I'm going to zoom in here on a spent flower head. So that's a spent flower head. It's not going to flower, it's actually going to seed. Going to seed takes the plant's energy and puts it into making seeds. We don't want that. We want to get rid of that and put it into making this flower that's right below it. So if I cut right there, now the energy is going to go into making that cute little flower all over the plant. And here we go. I am done pruning it. You can kind of see the stems I clipped. There's a whole pile on the ground there. Just took a few minutes. It's all neatened up, looks good. Any flopping stems were cut off. And now all those flower buds that were sitting right below the spent flowers, they're just ready to go. Within a few weeks, or probably at most a month, you'll have a gorgeous plant filled and blooming until frost. Here's an example of a Centranthus rubor. That's the same thing we just pruned in another part of the garden. We pruned this one a few weeks ago, and look at it. Isn't it beautiful? Just blooming again, and it'll keep going for months. You can use that same technique, either pruning just the spent flower head off or pruning the plant down by half or so to get all those spent blooms off at once on so many things. This geum here, you can take this stem and you can prune just the stem, or you can just take all these stems together and prune it right down to where the foliage is. The same thing is true with yarrow. Here's the yarrow right here. See that yarrow? That's really a spent flower. It's a gorgeous dark raspberry. And you can see these cut stems here. This plant was probably this feet tall, 3 or 4 feet tall, and it was getting kind of floppy and all the flower heads had turned to brown. So we just trimmed it down to about 1 foot tall. It was so easy because we sheared it all at once. Makes for quick work. And you've got some new blooms coming, see, with that much prettier, darker pink that we really wanted. Same thing is true of so many plants. These penstemon here, what a gorgeous color. This is ruby, probably my favorite penstemon. Incredible. I think it's beautiful just spilling out on the ground here, but if you don't like that look, then just simply cut the bottom areas that are floppy, leaving the upright stems. And again, same thing on this plant. If you have a flower that is spent, there's barely one here, but I'll pull this up. This flower is spent. And I'm just gonna trim it. I just trimmed it right underneath the spent flower. It only had maybe a few more to go. And I can just go through the whole plant and just do a quick trim of their spent flowers. Nepeta, or catmint, is another great example of this. Just cut it either under the spent flowers, right? These long stalks, or basically do the easy method and just shear it down to about 1 foot tall. See how this one is pretty much done blooming. Doesn't have many blooms on these stalks anymore. It's starting to look a little ragged. So we're just gonna cut that all the way down, about 1 foot down. Here is that same catmint in another part of the garden. And we cut it down to about 1 foot tall, or even 8 inches tall. Oh, probably a few weeks ago, maybe 3 weeks ago. And look, it's all blooming. It's this beautiful soft purple in the garden. was a little bit on pruning plants with long stems. Lots and lots of smaller flowers, long stems. You can basically shear them down to about half their height and they'll rebloom, or just simply snip kind of underneath each flower bud so that the buds below it can bloom. That's a couple ways to do that. But what if it's a really big flower, like a rose, or even like this dahlia here? So on rose bushes, see all these spent flowers here, but I've got my beautiful new blooms. You can, to be very precise, you can look at the rose bud, the spent bud here, count down, find the leaf that has 5 leaves and cut there. But you know, I find that you don't have to be that precise. Just cut these spent flowers off. And sometimes I'm just in a hurry. I just get them cut off because, again, I don't want the energy of the plant going into making seeds or into those spent flowers. I really want it to put its energy into making new gorgeous roses like this beautiful dark pink one. The same thing is true, by the way, of these very tall flowering plants. You prune them to get them to keep blooming. So foxglove is a great example. They have a huge flush of blooms. There's this beautiful white one here and another purple one here, and quite tall. Big flush of blooms in May and into June. But if you prune it right to the base, call it maybe 4 inches down, take that whole stalk off, it's going to spawn new flowers from the base. And that's true as well of delphinium. They're actually all pruned down over there now, but they'll be blooming again, and I can often get 3 cycles of blooms in a season from delphinium if I quickly prune them really to the ground, like 2 inches from the ground when they're finished. But back to big flowers. So with big flowers, like this gorgeous dahlia here, the dahlias are all starting to bloom. Aren't they amazing? And already I'm pruning the dahlias. They're so quick. So this is a spent flower. And for this one, I've got lots of buds on this plant. If you can see, there's the spent flower, there's the stem. And then if I cut this plant in half and cut way down here, I'm gonna cut off all these gorgeous buds here. There's a bud there, there's a new flower coming out there. So I'm simply going to cut, just like with the rose bush, just right underneath these spent flowers, just right there. Not cutting the plant in half. Keep deadheading, that's what it's called, pruning off the dead or the spent flowers. Keep doing that with your dahlias, and you are going to get gorgeous blooms all summer, often through well into October, even sometimes November. There are some plants that really don't rebloom. They have blooms coming for several months, like this gorgeous hydrangea. This is Invincible Spirit. So many of you have asked me about this one. I never prune my hydrangeas during the season. I just wait until after the season is done in the fall, or sometimes I wait even until spring. And then depending on the type of hydrangea, I may prune it right under the flower head, or in the spring prune it down to 2 feet. It's very important to know which hydrangea you have, because depending on the type, if you cut it to 2 feet, you'll cut their flowers off. This is one of the reasons when people ask me why didn't my hydrangea bloom, it's because they cut those little flower buds off the year before when they were cutting it down to 2 feet tall. Here is a foxglove. This one, as you can see, the flower is spent. And let me show you what I mean when I say prune to the base. There's the ground. I mean to the base. We're gonna take that whole thing off. We're just left with the leaves. And you do that and I get lots of new blooms from my foxglove. Here's an example of a little guy. He was pruned earlier on and he's sent up a new stalk. Here's lavender. It's gorgeous when it blooms. Unfortunately, it blooms kind of a short time, but it's blooming. It's still going. The bees are loving it. I'm not going to prune it yet, but probably in a few weeks, most of the blooms are going to look like these kind of faded ones here. We won't have these beautiful purple ones. And we will literally just cut this guy in half too. We often shear it with those shears I showed you before, like giant scissors, and we'll cut it down to about 1 foot tall. Here's more geum. They've been blooming since mid-April, blooming their little heads off. They are so gorgeous. Look at this flower. I just love that color. And so you can see all those beautiful evergreen leaves below. It's just quite easy to trim this whole plant down to just where the leaves are. So you're just trimming the flower stalks only. Like this one. Although it's got lots still blooming and coming on it, so I might trim off a few of the stems with spent flowers, but mostly I'm just gonna leave this guy. He looks pretty good. Many of the plants you're gonna prune now are the ones that started blooming in April or May, because now is when they have spent flowers. They bloomed for 2 to 3 months and their flowers are spent, and if you want them to keep going, you've got to prune them back. But this is beautiful hummingbird mint blue fortune, or the botanical name is Agastaki blue fortune. It is beautiful, that light purple with all the deep, you know, corals and hot pinks and burgundies we have in this garden bed. So I'm not going to prune it yet, but it will get the same treatment as those other plants I showed you, the perennials with long stems. Just cut the flower, you know, somewhere along its stem to get any spent flowers off. But it'll be a month or two before I have to prune this guy. So beautiful. And how about salvia? There's a beautiful salvia here called Caradonna. Isn't it lovely? Dark, dark purple, vertical upright stems. And this is what a spent flower on it looks like, that little stem there. It just lost all its flowers. It doesn't look too bad, but again, if you want to keep it blooming profusely, you just snip back all of those. See where we cut all the stems there that had been blooming and had stopped, and then that's how you get this rebloom of some of these little purple guys. Now for something quite different. So this plant is a verbascum. This is called wedding candles. It's my favorite one. The white flowers have these purple magenta with a little bit of orange centers to them, and it's just beautiful. And if I step back, look at all the wedding candles they had on them. It's like a candelabra. But those are now spent. So while they're pretty and structural in the garden and you can leave them as seeds, they will rebloom if you cut these back. And if you don't, it probably won't this season. So I'd like another bloom out of it. And I am going to cut this stalk all the way to the base because it's going to create each flowering stalk. See how each stalk, this one is a single stalk, and then it spawns all these little candelabras. This one is a single stalk, all these candelabras. So I don't want to cut each of these separately. I'm going to take this whole thing down, right down to the base. Get in there. So you can see where I cut that. Look, it's just right near the ground. And here is this whole flower stalk I just took off there. And I'm going to do that with every one of these. So they'll just be short, and that's okay. And then they'll bloom again in hopefully 4 to 6 weeks, and we'll get a whole nother flush of these gorgeous blooms. So one other approach to pruning and how you maintain your perennials for the longest bloom is these geums. That's what these are right here. They're mostly spent. So I will go ahead and, just as we talked about before, I'll come in and cut those down. But you can see that we did do some cutting before. It's got these little shorter flowers. Those are the new ones that came. So it's been blooming for 3 months. It's already got new flowering shorter stems down there. So I'm going to cut all of these taller stems. But sometimes these perennials that are so loaded with flowers get heavy and flop. And they flop on the ground. And you have two choices. You can simply just cut the flopping stems out and be done with them. Like this one right here it's kind of floppy. It could be longer and worse, but we could cut it off. But the other thing you can do is you just we have these steel half circles. You really hardly even see it, but it will hold the whole plant up. So if you have lots of flowers, you want to have those held up, hold them for as long as possible, and then later you can cut them down and then take these supports back out and use them on another plant. And again, here is more yarrow. This one we haven't cut back yet. You can see we put some plant supports around a few of them to hold them up because they were getting kind of floppy. They were so heavy with flowers. This is terracotta yarrow. It actually starts out orange, beautiful kind of peachy coral orange and shades of yellow. It's gorgeous, but it fades then to darker yellow, and eventually to a lighter yellow, and eventually to kind of a brown. So this one's almost done. However, look at this, new buds. That has not bloomed yet. And here's, you can see a little bit about that orange color I was telling you about. So that one's about to bloom too. So we'll just cut the tops off of this, and then it will be more upright. The new blooms that come out will be shorter. See how much shorter they are? So if you want not such a tall plant, you want it shorter, cut it in half, and your new blooms typically will come out shorter. How about pruning Alstroemeria, or a common name is called Peruvian lily? Look at this beautiful, beautiful section of, this is Peruvian lily, peachy orange. We carry it at the nursery. It's such a gorgeous color. It's got all kinds of, you know, pink and peach and orange in it. So these are not pruned the same way as the other ones. So you typically would think, okay, Lisa, what you told us was if it's got flowers on a long stem, then what I do is I just cut the stem to the ground. Because remember, if it's got flowers on a long stem, like a delphinium or a foxglove, you take it all the way to the ground. And then if it's just a mass of flowers like geum or yarrow or penstemon, you can just shear them in half, is an easy way to do it. Or of course, clip it down to about a foot or so, or 18 inches tall. But the Peruvian lily is a little different. And it's really, really fun to deadhead or take off the spent flower. So lots of great flowers. This flower is spent. Those are not buds. That's a spent flower. It's done. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the whole stalk and I'm going to yank it out of the ground. And it pulls out so easily. It just pulls right out. And you just do this. Just walk through and pull them out. And pull them out. And you'll have yourself a little pile of spent flowers, because the plant is going to produce flowering stems from the ground, from its roots. So it's not going to flower on this stem ever again. So there's no point really pruning it to the ground. Just pull it right out and let it send up lots and lots of new shoots. So you keep your garden looking like this for months on end. Let's talk for a minute about lilies. Those are tiger lilies. By the way, that's beautiful geranium roseanne in the foreground, and amaranth, a beautiful burgundy annual that is just stunning in flower arrangements. You could just see these three in a flower arrangement, couldn't you? So with lilies, be that tiger lily or most other kinds of lilies, aren't going to bloom again, and certainly not the oriental lilies. They won't bloom again. So there's no point in deadheading that. Just let the flowers naturally fall off, and you can prune the entire plant down to the ground in the spring. Here's another one. This is a tree lily. We also carry these at the garden. Isn't it stunning? Still blooming, smells amazing. But I won't prune it at all, not until November, and then I'll cut the stalks completely to the ground, and then they'll pop up and come right back next year. And here's our bed. We've pruned those centranthus, so they're blooming again. And we've got our geranium roseanne, which this actually really doesn't need pruning. Sometimes I never prune it the whole season. I wait till November, and then, the leaves have mostly gone brown, and we'll just trim it back. Or if it's getting a little out of control and exuberant, you can just trim it back. Now is a great time. Here's a great example of yarrow that needs to be cut in half. These really are probably standing 4 feet tall at the moment. They're actually too tall for their space. We may even take them out, but it is a beautiful combination with those pretty pink purple cone flowers. We will probably just cut these. They've lost their color. They were pink like this, and then they faded to a pretty white, which isn't so bad. But we'll probably cut them down to 18 inches tall, get them all nice and neat, and they'll bloom again. Whew, look at the colors in this bed. I just love it. These are the dark pink are hydrangea everlasting crimson. They'll actually fade to burgundy. The flowers will fade to burgundy very soon. They're already getting darker. It's such a great color. It's so unusual for a hydrangea. Intermixed here with salvia indigo spires and mallow. And the mallows are just looking lovely. So how do you prune all these guys? So again, for the hydrangeas, we won't prune them at all this year. We're just going to leave them. And the most we might do is in the fall, snip it right underneath the flower head. That's because hydrangeas, many of them, especially the big mop head ones, but not all, they make their flower buds right here below this flower. So you don't want to trim it too low, or you'll basically cut off the flower buds that will flower next year. So just right below that flower. For this beautiful salvia, it's got that one's actually broken, but it looks like a spent flower. So for the spent flower, we would just prune it right there, just right below the spent flowering stem, and keep lots of new flowers coming. And for the mallow, as it is for a lot of these plants, you can also just look. If I don't mention the plant you want to prune, look at how it grows. It's going to tell you a little bit about how to prune it back. This one is flowering up many different stems. It's got a central stem there, and then it has some side shoots off the central stem. If you zoom in close here, see if I can get it to focus, those are spent flowers, not buds, spent flowers. So when it gets quite tall and long, it'll be time to cut this. Sometimes I cut it all the way to the base, but that would actually cut off some of these side shoots. So I'd probably just cut this one about halfway down, right here, keeping in mind and looking at where it's blooming on the rest of the plant. And then that will again encourage more growth from the base and more flowering stems. This is Rudbeckia Cappuccino. What a gorgeous color. So we're going to run through a few quickly here on how to prune. So when this has a spent flower on it, you'd simply cut the flower down below the stalk. These are yarrow. We already talked about it. Cut it in half. And you can see the stems there where we've cut it right in the center, so it's about a foot off the ground. The geum, more geum. You can see that these plants, they used to have way more flowers on them. We've cut their stems here, and then they're already starting to flower again. There's more Centranthus. We cut those a few months ago, and they're blooming again, and they'll bloom until November, October maybe. So all these wavy plants with lots of little flowers all over them, often they are just flowering up different stems. So example for this wallflower, this is a wallflower, it's flowering up this stem. That stem is long and all those flowers are spent. So you're simply going to cut it right there and get rid of that stalk that's mostly spent so it can focus its energy on the new ones. Gar, it's the same thing. Cut off those long spindly stems when they're spent. We move through. Oh, but we have to be distracted now. Look at this Angelica. Wow, this is Angelica ebony. It's a really rare variety. When its leaves come out, they're this beautiful dark plum burgundy. The stems are plum, and these beautiful light pink flowers on them. Isn't it an incredible plant? And it has these crazy pods. Look at the pod. This video cannot do the pod justice, but their flowers unfold from these pods into these flowers. Again, more penstemon. This is a good example of spent flowers on a penstemon. If we come in close here, you can see the spent flower. Just snip it off on that long stalk, like that. Clean it up, and you'll get lots more flowers, like this gorgeous, gorgeous kind of magenta pink. This is a very unusual flower. I love this flower. It starts blooming mid-May, which is quite early for perennials. It'll bloom for 4 months. Isn't it sweet? So cute and short. This is what the flower looks like when the stem is spent. So this was flowering. We need to cut it back now. This one has already been flowering for a few months. We cut the stems back and then it's flowering again. Here is a stand of that beautiful verbascum or mullein wedding candles that we looked at in the back. And as I said, prune these down all the way to the base there. After it's done blooming, of course, still looks gorgeous, and it will bloom again. A beautiful section of salvia. As you can see, this one looks pretty good, lots of dark purple. This one over here, it looks good too, but it's time to deadhead it. So again with the salvia, you're just gonna prune underneath these stems, like that. Or if you don't have time for that, take your pruners or those big shears I had before and cut it right in half. Just cut this whole thing down to about a foot tall. It will bloom again and be beautiful. Here's delphinium. This is Black Knight. It's really a dark purple, but essentially this top stem is now spent. So we're gonna cut that maybe all the way to the base. However, it also makes blooms on side shoots. You can see the buds coming. So for the moment on this guy, because we wanna see those buds bloom, I'm just gonna cut the top there. We're gonna let those buds bloom, and when they're done, we'll cut it all the way to the ground. Even though it looks like there's no leaves left, it will sprout lots of new leaves and flowers for another bloom cycle. This plant is called Phygelius or Cape Fuchsia. It's not a fuchsia actually, it's a different plant, it's just its common name. It sometimes can be really hard to tell if the flowers are spent or if they're buds. So what you look for is that they're sticking their tongue out at you. So this one is spent. Can you see the little, I call it their little tongue, sticking its tongue out at you out of its little spent flower? That one's definitely a spent stem, and we're just gonna snip it right there so that it encourages more flower buds. And above it is this beautiful sweet shrub, Calycanthus Aphrodite. This is a long blooming sweet shrub. Look at that flower, it's so gorgeous. And I know many of you have bought these from me, and you're gonna love them. When it's flowering, don't prune it until after it's completely done flowering, which is usually about September. And then you can prune it, not for the spent flowers, because it won't flower again, but just for shape. So this is a 3-year-old plant. It's got huge in 3 years, kind of a gangly teenager. So in September, I'll prune it back probably at least 2 feet on each stem, just to have it thicken up at the base, be more bushy, and get ready for next year. Well, I've talked about the pruning of over a dozen different beautiful perennials that will bloom a long time if you'll give them the haircuts they need to keep them going. We'll just end with a little short walk through the garden. You know, we've been doing our pruning, so we have lots of great flowers. Many of these have been blooming for months already. Look at this beautiful persicaria here. We hadn't mentioned this one, but this one you can also kind of shear back or just simply cut the flower stems underneath the spent flower, with those beautiful hydrangea back there. That's glowing embers, one of my favorites, with Salvia Salvia Amistad, a beautiful royal purple. And here is a little mallow that was actually pruned for us by the deer, and they didn't really do a good job, because that is not how you should prune that. And then lastly, I'll leave you with a note on a plant you should never prune, really. And this is Dianthus, or Sweet William. Look at that color, it is amazing. However, I leave all the seed heads up, and the reason is it's a biennial. So it has leaves the first year and flowers the second year, and then the plant is done, the mother plant is done. But if you leave the seeds on it, that's these spent flowers, so they're making seeds, they'll drop to the ground, create more plants, and I never have to plant here again. It just forms its own colony. And it really is a gorgeous color in a plant. So a beautiful day in the garden. Hope you can come out and visit us this weekend. Any questions at all about plants or pruning, come on out, I'm happy to answer those.